Welcome back to Beyond Well. I'm Sheila Hamilton, and I am completely delighted today to have as our guest Andrew Solomon. Andrew is a writer and lecturer on psychology, politics, and the arts. He's the professor of clinical psychology at Columbia University and a frequent contributor to The New Yorker, NPR, and The New York Times. His books have won over 50 awards, including the National Book Award. But the book that drew me to Solomon's work was his memoir, The Noonday Demon, an elegantly written and meticulously researched memoir of
I had
depression.
always thought myself tough, one of the people who could survive if I'd been sent to a concentration camp. In 1991, I had a series of losses. My mother died, a relationship I'd been in ended, I moved back to the United States from some years abroad, and I got through all of those experiences intact. But in 1994, 3 years later, I found myself losing interest in almost everything. I didn't want to do any of the things I had previously wanted to do, and I didn't know why. The opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And it was vitality that seemed to seep away from me in that moment. Everything there was to do seemed like too much work. I would come home and I would see the red light flashing on my answering machine. And instead of being thrilled to hear from my friends, I would think, what a lot of people that is to have to call back. Or I would decide I should have lunch, and then I would think, but I'd have to get the food out and put it on a plate and cut it up and chew it and swallow it. And it felt to me like the Stations of the Cross. And one of the things that often gets lost in discussions of depression is that you know it's ridiculous. You know it's ridiculous while you're experiencing it. You know that most people manage to listen to their messages and eat lunch and organize themselves to take a shower and go out the front door, and that it's not a big deal. And yet, you are nonetheless in its grip, and you are unable to figure out any way around it. And so, I began to feel myself doing less, and thinking less, and feeling less. It was a kind of nullity. And then the anxiety set in. If you told me that I have to be depressed for the next month, I would say as long as I know it'll be over in November, I can do it. But if you said to me, you have to have acute anxiety for the next month, I would rather slit my wrist than go through it. It was the feeling all the time, like that feeling you have if you're walking and you slip or trip and the ground is rushing up at you, but instead of lasting half a second the way that does, it lasted for 6 months. It's a sensation of being afraid all the time, but not even knowing what it is that you're afraid of. And it was at that point that I began to think that it was just too painful to be alive.
So I appreciate you being with us.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
I have been wanting to ask you this question because as I was trying to pin you down for this interview, you were talking about the realities of COVID and quarantine, how it is completely difficult to get any sense of structure or rhyme or reason. Why do you think that is? What is happening with our psychology that is making quarantine so difficult?
Well, I think human beings are essentially social animals, and that we all thrive on our interactions with others, and that to some extent we understand ourselves through the way that we're seen in the eyes of other people. So we need not only the actual mirror in which we comb our hair in the morning, but also the kind of larger mirror that's provided by the gaze of other people. And most of us have a number of people we love and care about. And the quarantine has brought about two kind of complicated problems, one of which is that isolation and the sense of being cut off from the people in whose eyes you make sense. And the other, which is almost equally difficult, is that many people are in quarantine with members of their family or with a very small group of people. And there is a sense that that small group of people, becomes over time stressful to interact with when there's no respite and there's no getting away. So Sartre famously said that hell is other people, and I think hell is also the absence of other people, and I think we're dealing with both of those problems at once right now.
Wow, that is
stuck with a small group and away from everyone else.
That is one of the most brilliant descriptions I have ever heard. I've never heard it summed up more aptly. Where are you quarantining?
We're quarantining in Rhinebeck, New York, about 2 hours north of the city, where we have what was previously a weekend place, but where we've been in residence since March.
And so you're with your husband and your son, I imagine, right?
I'm with my husband, my son, and my husband's best friend who lives with us, who's sort of my son's surrogate grandfather. He's older than my husband and is filled in that role.
So, Andrew, I'm very curious about the next steps of this quarantine, whether or not you believe that in order for us to maintain some semblance of our mental health, we're going to have to start gradually expanding our quarantine bubbles to include other trusted members of our community groups, our friends, relatives.
The concern is that we've placed a great deal of emphasis on our physical health, which is without doubt better if we remain remote from other people and stay in strict isolation, and our mental health, which I think requires a certain amount of interaction with other people. And while I would never want to compromise any of the recommendations that exist in terms of our physical health, because they're obviously absolutely essential, our mental health also requires a certain amount of care and sustenance. Mm-hmm. And there are people who feel adequately connected by the process of having Zoom conversations like the one we're having right now. And there are people for whom that's insufficient. I had a letter a couple of weeks ago now from someone who wrote to me with the story of her best friend, who had kept saying, I'm all by myself and I'm finding it so difficult and I'm struggling and I'm feeling depressed and so on, and who finally killed herself. And so I think there are people for whom the isolation can be very toxic. There are people who will die of COVID without even having it because they're dealing with so much isolation. And I think it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. Some people need a small expansion. Some people need a larger expansion. I think some of the passion and fury that we've seen just lately in the protests that have taken place since the brutal murder of George Floyd have had to do not only with people's deep feelings about racism and prejudice in this country, but also with a feeling of being craved by isolation and having a cause that has involved gathering in large groups of people has felt crucial and essential in a way that it might not have in more ordinary.
I've been worried about my friends who had underlying conditions, including diabetes, including heart disease, including depression, including anxiety. And the messages that we're getting from the government never really attend to people's mental health. They don't talk about the potential worsening of people's depression or anxiety as if it's an illness they need to be concerned about. And yet others are saying this will be the long tail of the pandemic. The mental health crises will be the long tail. How do we begin to get people to understand that mental health implications will be just as costly, if not more, in the long run?
Well, in the first place, that's been very specific to our government and to, I think, the general incompetence with which it's approached this crisis. There's a perception that somehow the mental health problems affect those who are weak and in some sense worthless, and that the physical health problems may be affecting people who are strong and vital. There's a lot of prejudice built into it. When the COVID crisis began in Wuhan, the Chinese government moved thousands and thousands of mental health workers into Wuhan to help people deal with what they knew would be the mental health piece of the problem. Wow. Nothing like that has been undertaken by our federal government, though some state governors have made gestures in that direction. Presumably, and I don't have a crystal ball, but presumably at some point this virus will be brought under control. At some point we're going to be able to treat it, or we're going to be able to vaccinate against it. But I think it's going to take a much longer time to deal with the residual mental health complications. And I see them everywhere. I mean, I see from my father, who is nearly 93, the presumption that the life that he knew in New York, he'll probably never get back to in the way that he knew it. And he's sad about that, though not depressed. I see in my son, who's 11 years old, the stress and the difficulty of not having direct interaction with his friends when his friends have been so defining and so crucial to his life. He hasn't really seen another child in 2.5 months. And I see it in myself and in my contemporaries. I think there is altogether a sense that people are fraying around the edges, that when I talk to people, there's a lot of talk about how difficult things are. the mother of one of my son's friends wrote to me the other day and said, I can't get my son to get dressed. He just wants to wear his pajamas all day. I don't know what I should do. I think these children are going to grow up with a sort of strong influence from the crisis. As for people who are escalating into really serious illness, I mean, those are all examples of people who are in what I would call the worried well. But as for people who are escalating into serious mental illness tends to be cyclical. And once you have broken into it, once you have had whatever your genetic vulnerability is, triggered by external circumstances like this that are so difficult and traumatic, it can take a lifetime of management. It can be a recurring problem. At the very least, it undermines your sense of your own resilience, and that will have an effect for the rest of your life. And so I think even when we get COVID under control, that the sense of a traumatized population, traumatized by the loss of income, traumatized by the loss of company, traumatized by the loss of the secure sense that our basic way of life is invulnerable, I think that traumatized population is going to be dealing with a sense of fragility for a terribly long time and at appalling cost.
Yeah, you have been so open about your own decision to go ahead and use medication. And one of the things that you said that I thought was just brilliant is that there's this false moral imperative. The treatment of medication is not natural. It's so misguided. It'd be natural for people's teeth to fall out, but nobody is militating against toothpaste. I really want that as a bumper sticker on my car. But I'm wondering, because I have noticed that many of my friends who take medication regularly and do very well on it are not doing well under COVID circumstances. And so what's your advice for people in terms of how to maintain a semblance of your wellness during this time if the medications are not doing what they should have done before? Would you say that this is a time to be talking to your doctor about increasing, adding on? How are you managing it?
Well, I would say, first of all, that people have the idea that taking medication is somehow a sign of weakness. As I said a moment ago, that's been the position, I think, of our government. Actually, it takes a lot of courage and a lot of determination to figure out what your vulnerabilities are and to figure out the best way to address them. So people who are taking medication should not feel bad about taking medication. They should not feel bad about increasing or supplementing the medications that they're on. And people who don't take medication should bear in mind that getting through this crisis in a state of adequate mental health will leave them better prepared for life on the other side. And that the supposedly courageous thing of not taking medication may leave them very vulnerable on the other side. So I don't think medication is right for everyone. Some people have terrible side effects. Some people don't get good effects. Some people have other ways that they want to address the problem. But I don't think anyone should feel afraid of medication. For people who are on medication and not doing well, those are people who are vulnerable to depression. That's why they're on medication in the first place. Yeah. And depression always represents the meeting of your vulnerability, genetic or otherwise, and triggering external circumstances. And the triggering external circumstances are pretty enormous right now in a whole variety of ways. And people should be in touch with their therapist. They should do telemedicine if they can for talk therapy. And they should be talking to the psychopharmacologist or physician who has prescribed their medication and saying, look, I've developed these symptoms I had before I started medication. Should we go up? I've developed these symptoms, which seem to me to be very bizarre and which I've never had before. Is there a medication that will help me address them? And just do whatever you need to do to get through this crisis. And if you want to undo it when the crisis is over, you can undo it when the crisis is over. But in the meanwhile, don't let yourself go to pieces. It doesn't help you. It doesn't help anyone else.
You also gave some really beautiful advice about people who say they just want to muscle through these crises. For a person who said, look, I'm just going to try and see if I can get through the year. And you talked about you'll never get 37 back. I want you to talk about why that this pretty much American belief that we should muscle through these illnesses exists and what we can do to counter that belief.
Well, we still live in a society in which mental health and physical health are treated very differently. They're treated very differently in ordinary conversation. They're treated very differently by the insurance industry, despite laws that were supposed to change that have been passed some time ago and have proved largely ineffective, or at least somewhat ineffective. There are all kinds of situations in which the stigma attached